And we're good. All right. So first things first, would you like to introduce yourself and talk about some of your experience?
Sure. So my name is Gabby, and I'm a technical program manager at Autodesk. I've been here for like 3.5 years. And before that, I worked in industry as a mechanical engineer and got a degree in mechanical engineering. And my role at Autodesk is, so you can think of technical program management in my capacity as sort of a cross between an applications engineer and a program manager. So we're trying to support educators and students using Autodesk software, and sometimes that the skill set required to do that is more on the program management side. So figuring out, running programs, connecting people, making, forging partnerships, things like that. That's more in the program manager realm. And then the application side is sometimes it looks like technical training or hands-on workshops, or working individually with folks, and that's more the application side. So I'm very much in the software, but also do a lot of my job is connecting people and writing emails and support and things like that. So yeah, that's about me. And my background as a mechanical engineer really was working at startups. I worked at companies doing B2B, consumer products mostly. Well, I shouldn't say consumer products, because that's not B2B, but like hardware products in the B2B space. So equipment, things like that. Yeah.
Cool. So what brought you around to Autodesk?
Yeah, so I was working as a mechanical engineer. I worked for 3 different companies making hardware products. Most were around clean energy, or the last one was not clean energy, it was just energy, a little bit. Yeah, a little bit demoralizing in that one, but especially the last one, but all 3, I guess I just got a little bit tired of the lack of people focus in my work.
Okay.
I had my head down all the time and was like, doing design and doing analysis and doing engineering, and it's easy to lose focus of the bigger picture. So I was really craving that. And I wanted something that had more interaction, had more context. So I looked for various jobs, and this one stood out to me, and here I am.
Yeah, that's cool. That kind of rolls into my sort of follow-up question. So what I'm hearing is like one of the major differences with your work at Autodesk is like it's very people driven, because you are helping people like use the software and understand how to use a tool pretty much. Are there any other differences that you've noticed like at Autodesk specifically that were different from your experiences in industry before that?
Yeah, I'm definitely doing well, but besides way more people interaction, I not working on a single product, but rather understanding an application's use in many different industries is certainly very different. So, I'm not like working on one thing. It's a lot about understanding students' needs, understanding educators' needs, and really trying to develop programming and content and all sorts of things to better meet those needs. So it's a pretty eclectic job, but it's definitely very different from any previous roles. I mean, it's not engineering for sure. Yeah. But working with engineers and having that background and being able to understand them has certainly been useful.
Yeah, it's definitely important to understand sort of how engineers think, because I think the engineer types are sort of notorious for being not approachable and bad at communication.
Right.
And all of that stuff. So what kind of things do you do to sort of identify the customer's needs or the student's needs or who you're working with?
Yeah, so I took a class in college called user-oriented user-oriented collaborative design.
Mhm.
And that really set the foundation for a lot of what I do in my job, which is, you don't want to assume anyone's needs. You want to understand, and you really do that by listening. So excuse me, when we meet with people for the first time, we really want to understand their pain points, what they struggle with, what their current processes are, what they wish they had, and trying to meet them where they are and give them tools that they can use today.
Mhm.
So it's a lot about listening. It's a lot about understanding the customer, the user, and not just coming in and solving their problem, but rather working with them as a collaborator to come up with the best solution, because people know what they, people know best what they want and what they need. So that's a pretty interesting part of the job. It looks a little bit different every time. And, it's really fun when we come across new ideas that we haven't thought about from, customers or from ambassadors or people who are bringing new things to the table and new ways of engagement.
Mhm. Do you ever run into common issues when you're trying to interact with people, or early mistakes that you made when you were interacting with people and trying to help solve their problems, other than like just solving their problems for them and not listening, which is, I assume, the largest mistake?
Well, I think the largest thing is that, or not the largest thing, but a common thing is that we're really quick to sort of quick to dive in and say, this is what we can offer, this is what we can offer. But that's not always useful, because if they don't want those specific things, then they assume that it's not a good fit to work with us. So if we come in and say, we can offer workshops, but they don't want workshops, then suddenly the answer is a no, and then the conversation shut down.
Mhm.
And then we don't get the opportunity to hear actually what they need, or maybe they don't know what they need yet, but by talking out their pain points, we can figure it out together. So not assuming and really letting them explain their needs is certainly a lesson. I think also the hardest thing about the job is working with people who are resistant to change.
Mhm.
I think that people, especially educators, and I mean, this is true in higher ed, but it's even more true in secondary, are just underpaid and overworked.
Mhm.
And they don't, the time that they can spend on like curriculum development is just really small.
Mhm.
And sometimes they're stuck with curriculum they didn't make. Sometimes
Right.
they've inherited a program, they've inherited a class. Sometimes they come from industry and they know what they know, and they like, this works for me, and they're either too burnt out or just not interested, or don't see a need to like keep up with industry, or keep up with common trends, or like learn the newest stuff.
Mhm.
So I think just understanding and having empathy for that is really important. And it's like, you can't push on a string, right? If someone's not willing to change, then you have to figure out like, what's your best path forward? Do you try to persuade them? Do you let it go? Do you move on to someone else who wants to work with you? Like, what are ways to actually engage people who maybe through no fault of their own are just really resistant? And I think that that's definitely the hardest part of my job, because we're in the past, and even now, we're like assigned to work with certain schools, and we want to engage people at those schools. So when people don't want to engage us, we're kind of stuck.
Yeah, right. Well, and certain universities have good policies about like, hey, every X years you have to go into industry and like figure out what's changed, and other universities do not have the same opinions, and you'll have guys that have been there for like 30 years
Right.
who've decided this is just how industry is and we're not changing it. Yeah. So sort of going on that resistance to change, because that's slowly becoming a common theme with this whole thing we're doing for Women's History Month. How do you deal with resistance to change, especially like sort of the effect that has on the people that are affected by those people that are resistant to change, which is a really convoluted Kafkaesque way of saying, what about the students that, have to just deal with these professors who don't want to change?
Well, here's the thing is that it's not an awful thing, right?
Mm-hmm.
Like oftentimes these professors are teaching what they know, they're teaching what they've used, and maybe they're teaching on a software that's 20 years old, but it does what they want, it works for them, and they don't really see a reason to change. They sometimes need a catalyst to make them change. And I think understanding that catalyst could be us or it could be their students, and it's actually more powerful if it's their students.
Right.
So we with folks who are resistant, oftentimes we just let them be. You can't force someone to do something, right? Like that's fine. And we have plenty of work for people who are interested in learning what we have to offer. So but we often have the experience where some people will be resistant and then come back to us a couple of years later and be like, I'm really ready. Like my student showed me what you can do, and I like what you can do with this, and I want to learn it. And students are really key in helping their professors along and helping their educators along. Like educators aren't in it for the money, right? They're in it for the impact and for the for feeling like they make a difference. So they want to do right by their students. It's why they're in the role. So if a bunch of their students come and say, here's, look at what I did with this tool, look at like the power that it has, like, or, they show them, look at what, like we should enter this competition, and we can like make a team that can put an entry in, but we have to, up our game and learn this other thing. That's certainly a catalyst for change. And we see that a lot.
Yeah.
And so that's pretty cool. But yeah, in terms of what we do, like I think earlier in this role, I used to try to push more. Now I just sort of move around them. Maybe there's other professors and then they see their peers using it and they want to keep up. But it's really trying to understand, what motivates people, right? What motivates people to change? What motivates people to learn? And it's different for everyone, but we do see some common trends.
Yeah. Well, and I think that's especially true for Fusion, because I think a lot of people who have been in the CAD environment for a long time are like, oh, it's cloud-based, so it's terrible. And then you show them like, no, actually, you can do all of these like crazy simulations and things with not a very powerful computer, because you're using the cloud, you're using some other computing entity, and it's cool. And so, showing people also that, this is something that can work.
People are afraid of what they don't know. And cloud for a lot of, folks in, my parents' generation and older who are, 50 years of experience are like, that is scary. And I don't know how it works. And all the files are not on my computer. And that is scary. And that's true. They're not all on your computer. And it is, it is different. I can see how it's scary. I think there's all these, it's like, where is my data and what happens if the internet goes down, and sort of these apocalypse scenarios or whatever. And I don't think that's totally off the wall, honestly. I think that it's inevitable that we have to move to the cloud. Things are already in the cloud. Like, it doesn't seem like that's a fight that we can, that we can have. It's just a matter of when. So from that perspective, it's like, well, it's inevitable. It's going to happen. Get on board, right? And if it's not Fusion, it's something else. And honestly, everything is already on the cloud, right? Like maybe not your version of AutoCAD from 1993, but everything else, right? So I think that's a big holdup for folks. But I think once they see like what is actually possible, it becomes less scary. Like the collaboration aspect and being able to share all your files with your students and being able to manage your classroom and all these tools we have available. It's helpful to see it.
Right. Yeah. So pushing back past sort of resistance element of that, for students who are interested in learning and want to learn, how do you make material, or how do you develop workshops and all of that so that they're approachable for not only students of different educational backgrounds, but also of different, genders and all of that.
Yeah, it's a really good question. I think, to be honest, we don't do enough of that. Um, I think on the education team, we're really, we get a lot of feedback about the product, about our content, about our trainings, our educational materials. And the cool thing is that we've been able to bring a lot of that feedback back to the product team and actually see changes. So one thing is, we had some students and some professors at a school that has a program for the blind basically complain that there's no way to make Fusion bigger. Like, we need to be able to zoom in because, most of our students are not 100%. Some are 100% blind, but most are not. Most have, some visual impairment. And if things were really blown up, they actually could see them. And we have a lot of other software that you can just zoom in, 500% or something and use it. And why don't we have that? Great question. We pushed that up to the product team, and they were able to basically implement a change or are working on a change. I'm not sure if it's been released, but I've seen, tickets for it and progress made and stuff. It's assigned. And similarly for color blindness, we've gotten complaints about that. Like, if we have students who can't see reds, can we have an option to change that? That's another thing that's, being documented and worked on and things like that. So that's really cool. That's like a unique position that we get to roll those changes up. And that's more for physical impairments. But, in terms of different learners and especially for different people with different identities, we probably don't do enough. We had one actually male teacher comment that, all of our learning content is narrated by men, which is mostly true. We have some content that we have some specifically machining content that is narrated by a woman product manager at Autodesk. She's not a super frequent contributor, but there are some. But basically everything else is narrated by men that we put out, and it's a big problem. It's a really big problem, and I think that I thought about doing my videos that I would make. I think this might be the year. We'll see. I'm not making any promises, but I think that it's been a little bit out of my scope in the past. So we'll see. But yeah, I think that's a big problem, and I think it's also it's important that people see people like them in the industry and in these roles, and we certainly could do a better job of that.
Right. Yeah. Well, and hopefully at least having female Fusion ambassadors, of which there are quite a few. There's a good chunk of us just sort of drifting around helps.
It's not as good as it should be. I have the data. I think it's 30% are women.
Which kind of matches industry. So
yeah, it depends. It depends where in industry. It depends, if it's computer science or and electrical or mechanical, but it also depends on how far out of college you are. So, there's the most women in engineering, 1 to 3 years out of college. And then every bracket after that, the number drops off.
Yeah.
So if you're looking at senior engineers with 40 years, it's
almost
it's almost none. Yeah. So it's we don't have that many who stick with it. And, I was one of those, right? I was in engineering until 4 years out, and then I went into program management. So now I'm not in engineering anymore, right? So I'm one of those statistics. So it's hard.
Yeah. Well, and to be honest, I don't think your problem with industry as a whole is an unusual one. I think a lot of women run into that, where it's you get so far down the pipeline, it's wow, I don't interact with other humans or other normal humans on a regular basis, so you don't see the impact of your work. I think that's part of the problem, is bringing humanity back to
Mhm.
STEM fields. That would help.
Yeah, yeah. Engineering is very, I guess the sort of culture of engineering is very masculine.
Mhm.
It's a little bit unfeeling and a little bit robotic. It's hard. It's hard to exist in that space as a woman. It's hard to exist in that space as a non-binary person. Generally, it's hard to exist in that space if you're someone who's queer. It's just, it's a very bro environment. So it's challenging.
Yeah. Have you seen any improvements from like when you were in college and now seeing other college students?
Yes, I think that there's a lot more there's a lot more awareness of identity than there was when I was in school. Yeah, so I think that I think that that's really important, right? Like we have people claiming identities that they didn't claim in the past that now they're living as, and they're going through school with that identity, and they're going into the industry with that identity. And I think that's definitely different. And there's way more awareness of gender. There's way more awareness of patriarchy and racism and all of these, societal, pillars, I guess, that we have to work to deconstruct, while at the same time we have to work around. I think that there's a lot of people sort of reckoning with that in higher ed institutions in a way that they weren't when I was in school. And I graduated 7 years ago. So like, I'm queer, I'm married to a woman, and I was one of 2 openly out people in my graduating class in college. And now I go back to campus and it's like a third of a class is queer, and like a 10th are non-binary. And it's like a huge difference in the culture on campus. And they're all engineers, and they're all going to graduate and go into industry and take that identity with them. And I think that that's an improvement. And like, Audre Lorde says, the personal is political, right? So I think that that's really important.
Yeah. Well, and also the fact that people are encountering that in college, where if they're mean and make terrible mistakes, someone is hopefully going to tell them that they're being mean and making terrible mistakes. So then they can go into industry, treat people like humans, regardless of their identity or how they present themselves. We hope. Yeah, that's cool though. That's really, I've sort of started observing the same thing, and I think it's important, especially for me, it's important that I met non-binary people in college so that I know how to like address them, hopefully in a way that's respectful of their identity. So then when I go into my workforce, I can interact with that person in a way that's safe and good for what they need. Yeah. On that topic, both in college and beyond, how do you think that people can work towards making a safe space for people of minority gender groups, and also just minorities in general in that field, to share their ideas and be listened to?
Yeah, I think the biggest thing is learning how to not take up space. I think that white people generally, and men generally, take up a lot of space in the workplace. Like, we want our ideas to be heard, we're loud, we don't do a very good job of listening, we crowd people out. We need to be able to sit back and shut up, to be honest, and give people space to voice their opinions and their ideas. And maybe it's silent and then you just listen to the silence and you don't try to fill it. So I think that's one thing, is that, we can just we, meaning, I guess, speaking as a white person, can do a better job of just shutting up. I also think that we need to generally let go of the idea that this is a meritocracy, and that, if you get somewhere, it's not because you earned it necessarily. I'm sure you worked hard, but it has to do with also the privileges you were given and the opportunities you were given because of things that are beyond your control, like maybe that you have your class or your race or your gender, and that when we hire, we have to get rid of this idea that like it's a meritocracy and may the best candidate win, because the best candidate might just be the one who looks like you, or the one that you vibe with, or the one who comes from the same town, or you know what I mean? It's really all of it is flawed. And then we have this idea that, well, you're only qualified if you hit XYZ, but maybe those qualifications are flawed, and maybe that they don't, take into account actually what people can bring and what actually you need. Right. So I think that's a really big one. I think, we need systemic change, right? Like we need to end racism and we need to end homophobia. But in terms of like what individuals can do, I think especially folks in power at these companies can really reevaluate, what are they actually looking for when they hire? Like they think they want this, but is that actually important? Think about like the people who have contributed the most in your organization, like what qualities did they have? And maybe that degree that you require is not actually necessary or something like that. I think we can do a better job in that. We, not necessarily meaning Autodesk particularly, but all of tech, right? Yeah. And I think that that's pretty important. We have to understand that like people come from really different backgrounds. Some people can't do a million extracurricular activities in college because they have to work, right? And they can't, like there's a diversity of experiences, and we have to honor those and not just pick the candidate with 6 internships that we're all highly regarded or whatever. So I think that those are definitely things that I think about a lot. Yeah, and I think at work, right, we also need to really work on our culture. Autodesk actually does a pretty good job of this. We have a culture code, and we reward each other for various behaviors inside of that culture code, and around inclusivity and thoughtfulness and courage and things like that. But we have to develop a culture of respect and a culture of inclusivity. Yeah, and that can look like a lot of different things. And I think the truth is that no one really knows what it looks like or what it should look like. But we know it needs to happen, right? Like the number of Black employees in tech is like dismally low. Yeah, it's really bad. And same with Latinx employees, and same with queer employees. Like we're overrepresented. White people are way overrepresented, and to a certain extent, Asian people are also overrepresented. Just percentage wise. But I think really to focus on white people. Most of the CEOs are white. Most of the people in power are white, and I think that's where the work is. I think it's setting these cultural norms. I think it's really prioritizing putting people in power who don't look like you, who don't have your experience, and creating a culture of inclusivity.
Yeah. Well, and I think that the idea that like sometimes, the list of like what we expect before you even apply for this job, you don't have these, don't bother, like kind of questioning the validity of that and the necessity of that, because the fact of the matter is, I think a lot of people, I think the whole, you need 2 years, 3 years of relevant work experience to get into this entry-level job, that conundrum has been started to come to the forefront. But the thing we aren't talking about is like, we require you to take an internship, but maybe that student wasn't capable of like leaving where they were living because they needed to work a job, and So the idea that a lot of these things that we consider necessary for applying for a job are actually just making it harder for diverse voices to even consider applying to those jobs.
Right. Right. Totally. That's 100%. And, I think we prioritize a certain type of work over others, like, like you said, like maybe they got offered an internship, they couldn't take it because they needed to be home to help with childcare or something like that. So they couldn't go, to California to go to an internship or something. And they worked, locally instead, maybe in engineering, maybe not. But they don't have a big name on that. Like, we need to learn to, basically equalize and not undervalue certain types of work just because it doesn't have a big name on it or it's not in the things that we think are necessary. And I think a really important part of engineering that is underemphasized is the human aspects of it. I think there's a lot of engineers who can make stuff, who can design stuff, but there's not a lot of engineers who can understand and actually evaluate if what they're making is necessary. Like we don't have enough discernment, I think, in the field. We have a bunch of really smart people who are going to work on smart bombs, a bunch of really smart people who are going to work for defense industries and people, making products that literally kill people, right? And no kid like grows up being like, I want to make bombs, like that's so depressing. Yeah. And maybe this is like my politics spewing into this interview, but like, I think that we, as a field, engineering needs to do a better job of teaching. Maybe engineering education needs to do a better job of teaching students. Like, you can make it, but should you? Like, does this really need to exist? And then bombs are sort of an extreme example, but like, I don't know, any consumer product. Like, do we need this? Is this a good use of, our energy and our life? Yeah, our life's work, right? Like, do we need this, I don't know, plastic thing? Or should we be making things that are better for the world? Right. And I think asking the question of, is this worth my life's work? My time? Does this need to be made? Is a skill that overall most people lack. And I think that is indicative of like the masculine culture of engineering. Like, this like conquer mentality, like, let's make it, like we can, so we should, let's do it. Yeah. Right. It's very robotic and depressing. And I think it's one of the reasons that non-men leave in troves. It's just, it's not a very human culture.
Yeah. And hopefully that's changing, especially with sort of a wave of a generation is valuing environmentalism, especially because I think the newer generation, starting with like early millennials, is kind of identifying, hey, maybe we didn't need this thing, or maybe I think what we've noticed in particular is maybe this thing that we thought represented freedom is actually terrible for the environment, so it's not great. Like cars, for example. And hopefully that's shifting. I think people can also say that that's also sort of an opinion of privilege, though, just to play devil's advocate, right? Because like it is kind of a privileged position to be able to pick and choose what you think adds value and then work on that thing, versus a lot of the other mentality is just like a job, stay in the job, do a okay job, job of the job.
I think that's true. I do think that, like, I guess the population I'm talking about is people who graduate with engineering degrees.
Yeah.
Who I'm assuming have
freedom,
some sort of option, right, to choose what they want to work on. Right. I think it's totally different in different industries, and I can't really speak to that, but it's right. Some jobs are just jobs, and some people just do their jobs, and that's fine. And I think that that's dignified and that's great. And I think if you chose to go into engineering, and you went through, 4 years of schooling, and you come out and you have options, and then you're like sort of apolitical. There is no such thing as, not choosing, right? You're still making an implicit choice, even if it's not an explicit choice. And, you can't really get away from the politics of it. So I guess that's the angle I'm coming from. And I think electric cars are sort of a great example, actually. Personally, I don't think we need them. I think we should just invest in public transportation.
Right.
Like more cars, even if they're slightly better, is still an incremental change. We ultimately just need less people driving cars, not people driving different cars. Like we need a railway system in this country. Like we need better urban transportation. And then like if we can invest engineering work in that and not in, electric cars, then I think we'll be a lot better for the planet, for our air, for our cities, for for better use of space, right? Think about if we didn't have driveways or we didn't have as many cars on the street, like what we could use that space for. So, I think we get caught up in like the coolness and the technological innovation of what we're working on, but the bigger picture is like, do we actually need this? Like, what are the alternatives? What could we be spending our time on? What could, let's problem solve before we dive into the technical aspects.
Right. And and I think that really just pushes home the idea of like, not only do you need to sort of identify if this is a need or not, you need to identify like, is the solution really solving the problem? What is the problem actually? So it's like, does electric cars sort of solve the problem of getting clean, sustainable energy? Yes. Is that the problem? Kind of. Is it the real solution to the problem? Probably not.
Yeah.
So, yeah. Right. And at the end of the day, engineers are problem solvers. So the most important thing is being able to identify problems and then solve them. Yeah. All right. If you could solve one major problem in STEM or otherwise just instantaneously or progressively, because that's usually the actual solution, what would you want to solve?
I mean, climate change feels like the obvious one.
Right.
The two that come to mind are ending racism and climate change. Neither of which I think are technological solutions.
That's completely fair. Yeah.
Social, political solutions. Yeah.
Right. I think that the point about racism, because I think it's really easy for us white folks to be like, yeah, racism is over, we're done now. But like, there's so much just implicit racism that still happens, even of good people who are not necessarily conscious of it. So still bringing it to the forefront of like, hey, this is affecting people still, because there are no people of color pretty much in STEM still. And other such things is important to remember.
And we're perpetuating harm in the products we build, right? Like, so there's the pretty obvious example that in the data sphere is that, facial recognition technology is like does not work with darker skin. And like, who do you think developed that? Like definitely white people or definitely light-skinned people, right? And the lack of representation in the engineering sphere of people who are developing these products leads to bias being baked into the product itself. So, we are perpetuating racism when we don't when we don't have a diversity of engineers who are actually building those products. Like people just aren't thinking about it. And that's a shame, right? We're building the new world and we're bringing the problems from the old world into it.
Right. That goes right back to the example that Dr. Vostro had in my previous interview, was the same problem, like pulse oximeters that measure the oxygenation in blood couldn't get through nail polish and darker skin pigment. So they were getting incorrect numbers and giving people wrong data, which is genuinely harmful and concerning in COVID era.
Right. Oh, for sure. Yeah, I mean, there's so many issues, right? So many examples like that. And it's honestly embarrassing, right? It's really like, wow, we really should be, we should be better.
Right, because we've gotten so far and we still have such a way to go. So then I think my last big question, which I like to ask at the end of all of these, is what advice do you have, especially for students, like myself, or like minority gender groups, minority groups in general, especially those going in STEM fields who are exiting school, going to the workforce?
Yeah, I guess my biggest advice is don't be a martyr. Do what works for you and don't think you have to stick with it just because you have gone down that path.
Mhm.
Really make sure jobs work for you.
Right.
Quite simply, our relationship with capitalism is that, capitalism works because we are extracting labor at the lowest price, right? Like
Mhm.
that's a capitalist is like, the whole ethos is, we want cheap, we want people to work and we want to profit off of their labor more than we are paying them,
Mhm.
which is why we make money, right?
Mhm.
That's kind of the whole deal with capitalism. So remember that, like you are a worker, right? Like you are, like your labor is driving profit, and don't get so wrapped up in, um, you know, things like loyalty or things like, I'm so like, I feel so indebted to this company, or I feel
Yeah.
so, oh my God, my cat. Meh. Or I feel so, like wrapped up in the mission or whatever. Like ultimately, you signed a contract and that
Mhm.
contract says labor for wages. And
Mhm.
remember that, right? Like,
Right.
so like if it's not working for you, it's not like move on, right?
Yeah.
Like leave the industry, do something else. Like, I've had multiple friends go work on farms coming from engineering and then maybe go back to engineering or maybe not. But like,
Right.
things like that, remember that you're human and you need human things, and you shouldn't just try to like be a martyr in the industry because you need to stick it out for whatever reason. And you always have options. Early in my career, I stayed in some jobs too long because I
Mhm.
felt like I didn't have options. And looking back, I totally had options and,
Right.
you know, was very hireable and should have just left and moved on. But so, know your worth, and you always have options, and, don't be a martyr for the cause, whatever that cause is.
Yeah, that's awesome. That's a good piece of advice right there. All right, thank you so much.
Yeah.